this is part 2 of our lesson on the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. If you remember from part 1, the code, generally speaking, talks about 4 values that are important to us as project management professionals. They are responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. We have already reviewed the first 2, responsibility and respect, in part 1, and we are now moving on to fairness and honesty, and we also have some scenarios for you at the end where you need to select and define the ethically correct behavior. Fairness is the next section in the code, and fairness is defined as our obligation to make decisions and to remain impartial and objective. Fairness also means that we step outside of our own prejudices and that we don't play favorites. A simple example here would be that during purchasing, you grant the same face-to-face time to every vendor. You objectively listen to everyone, you offer them the same opportunities, and you make the buying decision not based on personal favorites, but based on facts that will be in the best interest of the project, and that the reasoning for your decision is openly communicated. And this little example here in regards to procurement pretty much covers the 4 aspirational standards that the code mentions in regards to fairness. We should aspire to demonstrate transparency in our decision-making process. We should aspire to be impartial and objective, and we should also re-evaluate our position and make adjustments when needed. And we should aspire to give the same access to everyone in regards to information, and we should aspire to make prospects equally available to all qualified candidates. Let me say a few more words here about impartiality. One aspect of examining our impartiality is, for instance, that we disclose our conflicts of interest. Let's say that in this procurement example, it might very well be that your brother works for one of the bidding companies, or you may own stock in one of these companies, or there can be any other scenario that from the outside might be seen as not too legitimate, or maybe as favoritism. In such cases, put yourself in the other people's shoes and think about how you would feel and what the ethical approach would be here in regards to clearing this up. And this then ties right into the mandatory standards that the code lists in regards to fairness, because it is your responsibility to disclose such conflicts of interests to our stakeholders. And because we have a conflict of interest, we will remove ourselves from the decision-making process, and we will also not try to somehow influence the other people who are still part of making the decision. However, it is sometimes possible that there is a way to mitigate such conflicts of interest. Maybe your stakeholders tell you that you perceive this as a conflict, it's really just half as bad, and you may rejoin the process, or you may be part of the decision-making process, but you may not put in a vote. Whatever the plan is, as long as your conflict of interest is disclosed and your continued involvement is approved by the stakeholders, you may of course continue. And then there is the situation where it may just seem like a conflict of interest to others, but not to you. For instance, it may very well be that your brother is part of the bidding team, but in truth he lives in a totally different town, and you haven't spoken to him in 5 years because you can't stand him. Now what? What would you say? Well, simple. If it seems like a conflict of interest, then you should treat it as a conflict of interest. Let's finish off the fairness section with the mandatory standards of favoritism and discrimination. And of course, by this we don't mean that you have to play favorites or that it is mandatory to discriminate. No, quite the opposite. You are not supposed to do that. So your actions may not be based on favoritism, nepotism, or bribery, and you are also not supposed to discriminate against others because of their skin color, age, religion, nationality, or because you don't like the car that they drive. Let us now once again take these standards, the mandatory and aspirational standards in regards to fairness, and turn them into appropriate and inappropriate behavior for us as PMPs. Here we go. On the left-hand side, we have behavior that's okay, and on the right-hand side, we have behavior that's not okay. Of course, mentioned this already, recognize and disclose your own conflicts of interest. That is correct. You be open and transparent in all your dealings, correct behavior there. You apply and you follow your organizational rules, and you grant equal opportunities to people. And then versus on the right-hand side, things that are not okay, you do not act upon potential conflicts of interest. You just, push them aside and let them be. You give more information to one vendor than you do give to everybody else, or you discriminate against somebody, or you make sure that your brother gets the deal. Nepotism, of course, are very unacceptable. Or even worse, you accept a bribe and then you act upon the bribe in a very unethical way, for instance by giving your vote to a certain vendor during purchasing decision making. Before we move on to the last section, which is honesty, let's take a look at the question of gifts. For this discussion, let's assume that we are still in the procurement phase. The vendor has just finished their presentation. It's 6 o'clock in the evening, and they now invite you to dinner. Question, can you accept this invitation during the procurement process? Is that proper, or would you have to decline it? Take a moment and think about this one. What would you say? What would you do? The answer is, of course, that absolutely yes. Accept the invitation. Going to dinner or going to lunch with a vendor, that is the social norm in many countries. There is nothing improper about it. And it's the same thing with pens that vendors often give, or a coffee mug with their logo on it. These small tokens are not considered bribery or improper. They are simply marketing. I myself, I stopped by at one of my clients about a year ago or so, and I brought everybody in the HR department some Swiss chocolate. I brought them the chocolate because I really like them personally, and because I'm from Switzerland. This is considered relationship building and not bribery. But what if the vendor sends you a bottle of wine? 2 bottles, 6 bottles, a whole dozen? Or if the pen that he gives you is a Mont Blanc pen that costs around $300? What now? It's getting a bit pricey here. Again, think a moment about this one. What would you do in a situation like this? Well, personally, I would take a look at my company's policies. Maybe the policy says that a bottle of wine is fine, or that anything up to $100 is fine, but even so, I would treat this as a possible conflict of interest. Take the bottle of wine, walk over to the office of my boss and show her the great bottle of wine that I have received, and ask if it's okay to keep it. That way, I have disclosed it. As a general rule, gifts are acceptable, but as soon as you yourself begin to wonder, is this gift still okay? Then you should be disclosing the gift. We are moving on to the last section in the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, which is honesty. Honesty is defined as our duty to understand the truth and act in a truthful manner, both in our communications and in our conduct. So our duty to understand the truth and act in a truthful manner. And honestly, honesty is, from my point of view, the most difficult one of these 4 really to live up to. Not because I constantly lie or because I'm dishonest, but because the way it is written in the code, because it's a bit, wishy-washy. You'll see in just a moment, but don't get me wrong, even though I say this is written a little bit wishy-washy, we must still do our utmost to uphold the code. Here is once again our table that shows the aspirational and mandatory standards here for honesty. First of all, the code tells us to aspire to earnestly seek the truth. Then it tells us to aspire to be truthful in our communications and in our conduct. It challenges us to aspire to give accurate information in a timely manner, and we are also supposed to aspire to create an environment in which it is safe to tell the truth. The first of these two are why I said it's a bit wishy-washy. Truth is a difficult thing to grasp. What is the truth to me may not be the truth to you, and the same truth can also be expressed in various ways. A good example are your local politicians, no matter where you live. Listen to two of them talk about the same subject, and after about half an hour you really don't know what the truth is anymore. But an implication of these aspirational standards is also that we don't tell half-truths. I mean, we have all done this. You omit a little bit of information here or there in order to make things look just a little bit better. Well, you shouldn't be doing that, but you knew that, and you didn't really need the code of ethics to tell you, right? On the complete opposite of these half-truths are then the outlined lies or deceits, and that brings us to the mandatory standards, where the code tells us what we don't do. We simply don't lie, we don't make false statements, we don't repeat information out of context, and we don't withhold important information either. And in particular, we definitely don't employ dishonesty so that we can personally gain from it. A very good example would be here that you, as a PMP aspirant, you need to provide accurate and truthful information to the PMI on your application, and if you should get audited in particular. Failing to do so could mean that you can face disciplinary action. One of them will be that you are not allowed to take the PMP exam. In the real world, these aspirational and mandatory standards will of course translate into behavior that is either okay or not okay, and I've given you a few examples already. Here again is a table that shows you 3 examples on the left-hand side with behavior that's okay, and 4 on the right. First of all, of course, under okay, information that is used for decision making that you are providing must be accurate and reliable. So if you have a decision-making board and the information that you give to them, you have to be certain that it's accurate and reliable. You will also accept blame. Once again, we come back to my example there with the child, the ball, and the vase that broke. Well, if you broke the vase, you will accept the blame of breaking the vase. And similarly to the first one, you provide complete and accurate information when you are asked to give information. On the other side, behavior that is not okay is misleading stakeholders or concealing bad news and just brushing it under the carpet there, or taking credit for someone else's work. Remember, there are a ton of people working on your project and they deserve credit for the work they do, not you as the project manager. Or burying information because there is bad news. Well, let's not conceal it because we're not supposed to conceal it, but why don't we just simply bury the bad news under a mountain of other types of news? That's what we mean by burying. And of course then lying and half-truths there at the bottom under the not okay. Of course, mentioned this before, we've all done it, but really the code of ethics now tells us you shouldn't be doing it. Let's take a look at 2 more examples here. First of all, as a project manager, you may be working on site for your client, and you may have access to proprietary and copyrighted material or information. Of course, the confidentiality of such intellectual property that you have access to must be maintained at all times. And the second example here are status report or press releases that you provide as a PMP, because the information that you as a project management professional provide in these documents must be accurate and truthful, however difficult it may be to define the word truthful. When you read the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, and I strongly suggest that you do read it a couple of times, maybe even 3 times, you should not just simply look at it as a document. Instead, look at it as a lifestyle. Look at it as the ideal approach for all of us to work in, and look at it in the context of your responsibility, your professional responsibility as a PMP. You may not agree with the speed limit in your country, but you will still try and drive accordingly, right? Similarly, you should be professionally responsible and execute your business based on the Code of Ethics. Let's now take a look at 5 scenarios that you might come across in sample questions. I will present the scenario to you, then I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about it, and then we'll reveal the answer and we'll give you some reasoning here. If you need more time to think than about these 10 seconds, then please go ahead and press the pause key on your player, and don't forget to answer based on the Code of Ethics. Scenario 1. You are brought onto an ongoing project and you see that project status information has not been correctly communicated to the stakeholders. What do you do? The answer to this one is, of course, quite simple. You notify the stakeholders and you then provide the correct information. Obviously, the correct information has been withheld here, maybe even some half-truths that have been told, and it is now your job as a PMP to correct this situation. Scenario 2. What should you do if your best friend owns a company that bids for a subcontract on your project? We have talked about a similar situation earlier on, and of course what you should do is you should remove yourself from the selection process and disclose this to your stakeholders. And remember that even if it seems like a conflict of interest, you should treat it as if it is a real conflict of interest. Yes, you may be the most qualified person here on the project in regards to helping in the process of making the decision and finding a subcontractor here. So there may be need to keep you on, but at least you have gone ahead, you have disclosed this conflict of interest, and everybody is now aware of this fact, and there may be some ways to mitigate your bias towards your best friend's company and figure out a way of doing this without having this conflict of interest influence the decision-making process. Scenario 3. Your latest analysis shows that your company's product might, under particular and certain circumstances, lead to serious health issues. The analysis also shows that, on the other side, the cost of a recall would be much greater than the financial risk of keeping this product on the market. So, what should you do? The answer to this one is really quite simple. You must, of course, recall the product. If your product harms only one human being, then it isn't worth all the money in the world. You must do the right thing, and you must protect the humans that are using your products. Just imagine if that one person were your mother. Scenario 4. Your company is entering into a new market and you need to buy a registration certificate. Is it okay to pay the foreign government a fee for the routine action of obtaining this registration certificate? The answer is yes, that's okay. After all, it's just a routine action. The fact that I sneakily put in the word here, foreign government, into the question should not make you jump to a conclusion. We are just paying the normal fee for this transaction, and everybody else also has to pay this fee in order to get this particular registration certificate that we need. Scenario 5. Is it okay to pay a fee to a government official to ensure that your application will be approved and processed in a speedy fashion? The answer to this one is, of course, that it is not okay, because this is now considered a bribe. And please remember, if you happen to live in a country where this type of governmental support is the norm, paying fees to officials to ensure that your application is processed, etc., then remember to answer such questions on the PMP exam based on the PMP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, which says that this is not okay in a project environment. Let's review. The PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct contains aspirational and mandatory guidelines of your professional responsibility as a PMP. You may find sample questions out there that make you decide whether or not a particular standard is aspirational or mandatory. Therefore, you must know into which category these various standards fall. You must, of course, be able to do the right thing based on the guidelines that we find in the Code of Ethics. Conflicts of interest are to be watched out for, even if they just seem like a conflict of interest. And finally, if you come across a situation where a PMP is in clear violation of parts of the Code of Ethics, then you must report these violations to the appropriate bodies. And this concludes our look at the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct.